Think about the exchange here. The merchant of death for a WNBA star who was picked up for marijuana. What a victory for Putin. But what else it does, it makes every American who is overseas vulnerable. Why? Because they can pick you up on a trumped up charge to get somebody they want out. This is what's wrong. This is a sign of weakness. It goes back to what Secretary of Defense Gates said, that every decision that President Biden has made in his 40 years when it comes to foreign policy has been wrong. And this is wrong. He left a Marine behind. Think about it. It's not an equal exchange. I'm glad an American's coming home. She was arrested for a trumped up charge. But to exchange the merchant of death for this?
For this? Kevin McCarthy is upset that Brittany Griner has come home now from that penal colony that she was put in Russia. He's very upset about it because they left Paul Whelan behind. That's the narrative that's going around amongst these conservatives still talking about this. Very upset about it. And you'll see the theme behind this because Tucker Carlson helped him out in this same thought process. See if you can find some similarities in the way these two talked about it. Watch this.
So the former Marine, who's been there for 4 years already, gets left behind in Russia, while the celebrity athlete gets busted with hash oil, is championed by her celebrity media friends like Gayle King, and is home in just months. I mean, that's what happened. And it seems like a metaphor for how America under Joe Biden is working at this point. But no, says Joe Biden, we had no choice but to take Brittany Griner over Paul Whelan. Putin demanded that.
You know how Tucker Carlson speaks to Joe Biden all the time, and that's what Joe Biden told me. He said they demanded it. That's what they told me. That was he was left behind. You notice in that theme. For one more piece of their hateful legitimacy tour, John Boehner was also talking about this as well too. Think about his wording here when he talks about what happened and the fact that Brittany Griner came home. Watch this.
I'll just note that Paul Whelan, who was likewise set up by the Russians back in late 2018, so when I was at the White House, is still in custody. And I'll just note the historical fact that the possibility of a boot for Whelan trade existed back then, and it wasn't made for very good reasons having to deal with Victor Bout. This is a huge victory for Moscow over Washington.
Did you guys hear that? John Boehner said a boot, Victor Bout, for Paul Whelan trade was offered or brought up or considered or something during the Trump administration, but they didn't do it for obvious reasons because it had to do with Victor Bout. That's what he said. Keep that in mind as we go through this, because I will first go through this theme. There's the replacement. Can't believe that they left him behind for Brittany Griner, this disgusting human being, which, as you heard Kevin McCarthy say off at the beginning there, that, oh yeah, she was on trumped up charges too. We should get her, but then we shouldn't. But then we should, but they shouldn't. As long as you still don't find yourself saying F Brittany Griner, but then kind of, maybe you can toe that line. So this was the one theme that went across all three of these hateful people was, this is the point behind this. It has nothing to do with whether or not you want Paul Whelan home. It has to do with the politics. Watch these parts from those three people's speeches and this common theme.
This is what's wrong. This is a sign of weakness. Every decision that President Biden has made in his 40 years when it comes to foreign policy has been wrong. And this is wrong. He left a Marine behind.
And it seems like a metaphor for how America under Joe Biden is working at this point. But no, says Joe Biden, we had no choice but to take Brittany Griner over Paul Whelan.
This is a huge victory for Moscow over Washington.
This is all about the politics behind it, Jessica. They want to make sure they say weakness, international, they're going to take up more people. If you believe that stuff, that's fine, but would you have said it if it was someone else in office? Do they care about the country and the people in it, or do they care about the politics? I think we already know that answer, Jess.
Yeah, it's just insane to hear them talk about leaving a Marine behind. When this trade was on the table, John Bolton said Donald Trump could have brought Paul Whelan home, and he chose not to. And there's a reason he chose not to. There's some kind of calculation that you make in terms of morality when you have someone overseas who is a basketball player who went over there to make more money. Let's keep in mind, Brittany Griner likely would not have gone overseas to Russia if she was not a black woman, because there's a huge pay gap between women's basketball players and men's basketball players. And she had to go over there to work a tournament to make more money to supplement her income. She was not making the same kind of calculation that a Marine would make when they choose to serve the US government. So the fact that she was detained, there was more pressure to bring her home as a civilian than there is for a Marine. And they're trying to make it seem like it should be the other way around, which is a bit ridiculous when you consider the kind of fascism that they're pushing, that we should put our military above everyday citizens. No, members of the military make that calculation when they decide to serve. And then the fact that they keep calling the arms dealer a merchant of death is absurd. They just voted on an $858 billion defense spending bill. We are a merchant of death as a nation to the rest of the world.
Jessica, you can't say that. You kidding me? We don't sell arms across the country. We don't ignore people who've murdered journalists that were here because of sales and exchanges. Come on, what are you talking about? Why do you make these things up? Speaking of fascists and making things up, here's Donald Trump. He responded to it as well. Maybe this is why there's kowtowing to this whole line. This is what he said on Truth Social, of course. What kind of deal is it to swap Brittany Griner, a basketball player who openly hates our country? I want you guys to pay attention to how many contradictions come between this and the next stupid ass thing this guy says. Anyways. Who openly hates our country, for the man known as the Merchant of Death, who's one of the biggest arms dealers anywhere in the world and responsible for tens of thousands of deaths and horrific injuries. Why wasn't former Marine Paul Whelan included in this totally one-sided transaction? He would have been let out for the asking. Remember that. He says he would have been let out for the asking. And he said, what a stupid and unpatriotic embarrassment for the USA. And also keep in mind, John Boehner, who worked in this guy's administration, said we had a chance. As you listen to this next truth from Trump. He said this: I turned down a deal with Russia for a one-on-one swap for the so-called Merchant of Death for Paul Whelan. He turned it down, he says. I wouldn't have made the deal for 100 people in exchange for someone that killed untold numbers of people with his arms deals. I would have gotten Paul out. However, just as I did with a record number of other hostages. Pause. Bro, you were in office. You would have if what? If you would have been in office? This guy doesn't know whether or not he served as president or not, because he kind of didn't. He just served himself in the presidency. More. He said the deal for Griner is crazy and bad. The taking wouldn't have even happened during my administration, but if it did, I would have gotten her out fast. Which one is it? Is she a hater of America? Was she put in place of Whelan for coming? Was he left behind? First, suddenly he says, I would have gotten her out, but I wouldn't have gotten her out. She hates America. But then if she would have gotten taken by while I was there, I would have gotten her, but then not. And then Paul Whelan, I had a chance, but then I decided not to, but then I would have if I was president. What the hell is he talking about? No one knows, including his followers, as long as he says enough hateful things and they nod their head and go, whatever you say. If you ask someone who likes what he said, they probably can't come up with a full conclusion as what the hell any of this means. There's a better part about this, Jessica, though. I'm sorry how long this is taking, but this is the kicker. If only we had somebody to clear this whole thing up. Someone who maybe knows Paul Whelan, maybe his twin brother, David. He had something to say about this whole thing with Donald Trump and how much he cared about getting his brother out of Russia. Watch.
I think the first 2 years, partly I think the Trump administration was not prepared to or not interested in working on wrongful detention cases. And partly the tools didn't exist during those first 2 years of Paul's detention. We're starting to see that change. The Biden administration is much more engaged in wrongful detentions, and the executive order that President Biden passed or signed last year, plus the Levinson Act, have given the government more tools to help wrongful detainee families, but also to try to start to punish the nations who are doing this. As far as I can tell, the State Department, the National Security Council, the White House, they are all 100% engaged on bringing Paul home.
He said the Trump administration either wasn't prepared or had no interest in bringing home his brother. He wasn't done calling out names though, because he went on Twitter and he said this. Former President Trump appears to have mentioned my brother Paul Whelan's wrongful detention more in the last 24 hours than he did in the 2 years of his presidency in which Paul was held hostage by Russia, which is zero, he says. I don't suggest he cares now any more than he did then. Again, zero. One last part, because I love this last thing. I saw this after I was halfway done with this whole thing. Mike Pompeo also served in the Trump administration. He went on Sunday shows and he was asked directly, so did you guys have the opportunity to get Whelan home? Because there's a lot of people talking like John Bolton. Let's see what Pompeo had to say. Wasn't much, but watch.
You were CIA director, you were Secretary of State. Certainly you would have to know about those discussions. Is that true? And why wasn't the deal made?
Shannon, great to be with you. Thanks for having me on. I don't want to talk about the private conversations we had. Ambassador Bolton's free to say whatever he might like. But we were very focused on getting Paul Whelan out, every American back home. There was... And that is not a good policy.
Is John Bolton telling the truth?
I don't want to comment on our internal discussions. We were working hard on each of the cases, including Paul Whelan's case during my time in service.
Follow-up question, Burbank, which I would hope she would have asked him next, but she didn't. So is David Whelan lying? Who's lying here? Who's lying?
It's a great question. Obviously, the members of the right that are saying that Joe Biden is the reason we can't get people like Paul Whelan home are ignoring the fact that Donald Trump also did not try to get Paul Whelan home. It's obvious that all of those guys are lying, because why would John Bolton lie? John Bolton's the dude who's always telling the truth by accident these days. I mean, let's not forget his track record here, especially recently, right? And his history of being involved in some of the most ridiculous coups we've attempted as the United States government. He's been in the State Department for quite some time. Trump bringing him back was a callback from the earlier years when things weren't going so well. And the reason that we have this problem of recurring hostage crises, thinking of the Iran hostage crisis as well, is because we make enemies abroad. It's very simple. The solution to situations like this is not we need to be tougher and have a bigger military. We already have a larger military budget than the next 5+ nations combined. The solution here is not to be tougher and be the big bad wolf in the international arena. The solution here is to actually start peace building and help investing in other nations that we've destabilized abroad for centuries, especially under John Bolton.
Jesus, Burbank. First you're talking about arms dealing for America. Now you're talking about peace dealing and trying to quell conflicts across the world. What's the matter with you? It's like it's Monday or something, the best damn day of the week.